Alrighty.
Good evening, everyone. It's very nice to be here together. We have a really interesting panel. It's the right season of the year to be considering the moral dilemmas we face. And our panel is going to discuss the key issues and challenges of our time as we approach our collective rethink on Yom Kippur. But I'm also keen to make sure that we talk about things that impact on us personally. So there's geopolitics, and then there's national stuff, and then there might be more local or personal issues that we hope we'll touch on too. I'll introduce our panelists. John Kendall is a strategic analyst with a background in tech, scenario-based decision-making and complex problem analysis. His recent work includes an examination of the strategic and operational implications of the war in Ukraine. And Jonathan Freedland is a frequent visitor to our show, an award-winning journalist, author and broadcaster. He writes a weekly column in The Guardian and is the presenter of BBC Radio 4's contemporary history series, The Long View. And Rabbi Jonathan is our senior rabbi from Salty Judaism, and well known to all of us. Thank you. I think there's always lots to talk about, there's always lots going on. So John recommended that maybe I would ask each of our panelists to say the top 3 big things that are on their mind, and we would see what kind of common ground we might get. You will choose your 3 things and defend your choice of 3 things, and then we'll decide where to take our conversation from there. So I hope you can talk about three themes or 3 moral dilemmas, and you could pitch them at different levels. If you wished, you could make some of them really global, big, long-term things, and you can make some of them smaller or more local or whatever. But let's start opening up the floor to the ideas that we'd like to discuss. So, John, are you happy to go first?
Delighted, and thank you. It's a real privilege to be here. And I have to say, I really enjoy listening to the beautiful prayers. And as a person of religion, it crosses a beautiful gap for me to listen to that. But on a less positive note, so I spend a lot of my time involved in disasters, looking at disasters. So I've 3 off-pat, if you like, for you. I'll list them and then explain them very briefly, so we've got time for lots of other things. The first is obviously climate. The second is the effect of autocracies around the world. And the third is around growth, equality and equity. The first, in terms of climate, I think is geopolitical, but right down to individual. And I hope we can explore that as we go forward. And it's linked with technology, it's linked with our personal choices, it's linked with the strategy for many countries. The second, for me, is autocracy. Because what we see is increasingly strong competition in the global system by autocracies, led by Russia, China, a pretty strong play by Iran. We're seeing other countries getting closer to that. We see Hindu exceptionalism rising in India. We can see Turkey rising in its own way as well. And of course, autocracies have an advantage over democracies. This is not an advert for autocracy. In that they can do strategy and they can think long term, whereas democracies are prisoners to the population's immediate needs quite often. But that's maybe a theme to explore. The third one for me, and it probably intersects quite a lot with climate, is about growth, equality and equity. So we live in a world where we predicated ourselves on constantly growing our economies. As part of that process, we have added 30 trillion tonnes of human manufacturer-made things. We are in the Anthropocene era. Now, in some ways, that's a huge triumph. Look at some tremendous advances in civilization. But equally, it is a huge burden upon the climate. It's also a burden on societies. And as global communications link, that dissatisfaction between those who have and those who have not grows. And if I was to draw a shape around the parts of the world most affected by climate change, food security, temperature, storms, and I overlap that with a sense of loss as a result of what we have done, I overlap that with the effects particularly of Russia as an autocracy. and the control of refugee flows through Libya, where Russia's allied with General Haftar. The eastern side of the country, it's very sadly suffered disasters recently itself, but also through Syria with President Assad. The ability to control population flows if climate goes further on, and also if the food supply from Ukraine is interrupted, because 40% of the World Food Programme's aid comes from Ukraine. Lots of other things. If you overlay all of that, the ability to destabilise the globe and destabilise the European community, the Western community is huge. I remain an optimist though. And on that happy note, I have hope, and I'll pass the baton if I may.
Thanks, John. We'll hear from Jonathan, and then when everybody's given us their litany of woes, we'll decide what to do with it.
I think, John, you've picked up the Jewish vibe very quickly. The Jewish vibe, I think, is to say all kinds of tremendously pessimistic things, and then say, but I yearn and hope and want to be an optimist. And that's where I think we land ourselves. So I could, because you asked us, Rabbi, for 3 things that sort of preoccupy us. And so I could say do 3 things in 1 word each, and I could say Trump, Putin, Netanyahu. And in a way you would all know what I mean. So that is definitely part of what keeps me up at night. But I will go for 3 other things because I want to take up your challenge of thinking big, thinking a bit less big, and then finally personal. So the really big one is exactly what you've spoken about so well, and I won't therefore spend too long on it, but the point about climate and the climate crisis, the climate breakdown. The paper I work for, The Guardian, has stopped calling it climate change because we thought that people didn't think it was urgent enough or serious enough, that phrase. And so we only now speak of the climate crisis, climate emergency, or climate breakdown. There are lots of things to say about that. The thing that keeps me up at night, though, is this notion that I think people thought that as long as you gave people lots of facts and information, then action would follow. And this book that I wrote last year about something completely different, which is about Rudolf Weber, who escaped from Auschwitz to warn the world along with Fred Wetzler. What fueled them in their escape was their belief, their hope was that the minute you put the facts in front of people, well, of course the world would act. And their heartbreaking discovery was that that doesn't happen like that. Even when people know, they don't always act. So that's the thing that I don't know how to think my way through that with climate crisis, which is, every day, every other day, there'll be some new report. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel will tell you we've already gone too far, we're on borrowed time, and then people will still, talk about Hugh Edwards or whatever it is. We're very good as a species of looking elsewhere. So that's the climate piece, which we can get into more. The second one is about, I was going to say, the societies that I myself feel very invested in and close to, and I'm going to abuse my position here or take a liberty by doing 2, which is in Britain and in Israel. So, which are both societies that I, and I think a lot of people in this room will say we care about very deeply. So the dilemma I feel in Britain, it can be expressed quite short and briefly, which is, on the one hand, the challenges that will face a future government are so great that they require really quite radical action. And yet, on the other hand, if you propose radical action, given the society we have and the press we have, that risks not getting the power you need in order to implement the solution. So I look at Keir Starmer and Labour, and I feel for them in a way, because I know that they know how big the task is, and yet they can't say it. And they can't come up with remedies, because if they did, then the people whose votes they need might recoil. So that's a really tricky dilemma. And then the other society I care very closely about, even before we get to America and Trump, is Israel. And there we all know that there's this huge judicial crisis, which is really a democratic crisis. And it's now in the hands of the Supreme Court. And it's very tempting to think, well, that's not a dilemma, that's easy. Of course they should slap down this first move. It's not quite as easy as that. They've got a dilemma too, which is they know this move will erode democracy, abolishing the reasonableness clause, the clause that allowed the Supreme Court to strike down unreasonable law. They know they should strike that down if they're to save democracy, and yet the point is to assert the rule of law, and maybe the rule of law doesn't allow them to strike it down. So you're in one of those moments where democracy is slightly powerless to defend itself. Because if we stick to the rules, as it were, then we may, by the very act of sticking to the rules, allow the rules to be destroyed. It's a really hard dilemma for the 15 judges of the Supreme Court, and I don't think it's obvious which way they're going to land. And yet, as they do it, they may do it with a very heavy heart. And then finally, myself. So, and in a way, I touched on it with my, my co-opting of you into the Jewish tradition of pessimistic optimism, which is, I don't know, in my day job, writing commentary in the Guardian and broadcasting, whether to be as sort of frank is a better word than truthful about how bleak everything is, because if you do that, you turn people off, and you risk being this kind of, Cassandra, gloomy Jeremiah figure who is, and after a while people switch off. People do want to, watch the football or Strictly or whatever, and they don't always want to be told that, the planet is too hot and Putin is, an evil dictator and Trump might win and Netanyahu is destroying Israeli democracy. I mean, after a while, enough. And so I sometimes feel I've got to sweeten and sugar that pill, and yet I don't feel necessarily doing that. It's completely honest. And so I feel that's my personal one that actually does, I wrestle with that one. So those are my three.
Yeah, pulpits and columns are rather similar in that regard. I find the same dilemma with sermons. I'm very taken with the conversation we had and with what you said, Rabbi Zahavit, and actually wrote earlier, which I didn't take in the first time, for which I apologise, to just push this down into the now. So I'm going to, instead of saying my three slogan things, I'm going to say three things which they really actually are keeping me up at night. I really can't sleep a lot of the time. I'm quite a keen runner, and one of the problems is not bumping into people, or rather not having people bump into you. I'm also mindful of the saying in the Ethics of the Fathers that one should greet everyone one sees. You try greeting people and they kind of blank you and they run straight at you and you have to dodge because they aren't where they are. They've got headphones on and they're talking to somebody. Somebody from the 18th century, we think we're all lunatics talking to ourselves, but we're not where we are. And I used to run for a while listening to things, and I've stopped doing that because I want to be where I am. And that not being able to be where we are feeds into the fact that the empirical doesn't really address us, because we spend a lot of our lives in virtual realities which are easy to dwell in. And that, I think that may be part of the consequence of failing to act, part of the cause for failing to act when we need to act. So that's something I'm kind of mindful of in the street, and has a larger sort of social consequence, because it represents the heightened individualization of our society and the lack of investment in communal institutions, including the NHS, and community. The second is cruelty. One of the highest values of Judaism is loving kindness, and I find myself struggling to avoid certain kinds of cruelty by trying to treat people decently, by being vegetarian. It's not good enough. Vegan, is the only way. But also I know that I'm completely complicit and implicated in a world which inflicts an enormous amount of cruelty, both on other people and on other sentient beings. And I kind of don't know how, I can't get out of it. And that I feel very ashamed. And of all, I could pick one word out of the thousands of words of the liturgy for the Day of Atonement, to say, which would be Bagadnu, we've betrayed. And I feel like a traitor towards fellow life. And that perhaps is the one that bothers me the most of all. And the third, picking up on what you said, is I feel I'm witnessing the destruction of the Judaism I passionately believe in. Because what's at stake with what's happening in Israel, and perhaps this is a microcosm of the kind of broad humanitarian values as well, is that the development of autocracy, which claims religion as its ally. This is what God says, this is what we do, we have our authority from God. You can see that in the 17th century slave trades slogans and the colonialist exploitation of land. This is a complete antithesis of everything I believe in Judaism, and I think that people are going to say to us, if this goes ahead, Have you learnt nothing from your history as outsiders and victims, as marginalised people? Have you really learnt nothing? And I won't have anything to say.
Thank you all. That was a really rousing round of really fascinating things. Actually, I wondered if one of the threads that we might pull together was this thread about individualism, but also about knowing what's out there and wishing for better that drives migration as well. Because you mentioned this, I think John may have mentioned this, but actually it also lies, sort of behind the Israel problem as well. That there's a sort of fetishization of having a majority of Jews in Israel and making sure that Jewishness means some kind of ethnic state that is run for the benefit of Jews. But actually Israel is a much more diverse state that, because of the way the world works, people are fleeing to Israel for some of the good things that countries in the global south, either they're running away from bad things that are happening, or they're running towards the good things that progress and advances in technology and in the standards of living can deliver. So I'm very interested in that interconnected world and how it drives the migrations of people. Is that this seems to be part of the one side, the atomization of like everybody's in their own bubble, and on the other hand, everybody thinks that they could run and enter another bubble where things might be better for them. And I'm intrigued. I wonder whether we might reflect on thoughts about refugees, the free movement of people, and what Judaism has to say about the rights of others, including their right to settle, and to live amongst us, within us, alongside us. So maybe Jonathan and Rabbi Jonathan, maybe you might each have something to say.
So, I think that one of there are many drivers of the refugee crisis, but one of the things I noticed when we were together actually in the jungle, so-called in Calais, everybody's got a mobile phone, and most of them are iPhones, as well as food and water. The most significant thing people need is the capacity to recharge their phone. And having such a phone means you can see how anybody lives anywhere in the world, which means why should somebody not aspire? How can we tell people, stay where you are, don't aspire? That's not okay. And the Torah says that when a refugee comes to your land, they should live in a place which is tov lo, good for them, where they have opportunity. So these are taking that to a kind of global level. Governments like ours would do much better to invest in ensuring that the globe is livable to a decent standard of living in parts of the world that are being destroyed by climate change than the whole effort to stop the small boats, which is going to fail and is connected with levels of cruelty and brutality for which we pay, which are unthinkable. And that's one thing I wanted to say, something completely different, which is, I said that sort of we want to live in our own worlds, but something that is optimistic to me, that really inspires me, is the bit that really keeps me going, is that one looks at the national level and the big picture level, it's very difficult. But the number of people who are forming local groups to do something, to look after their neighbours, to make their neighbourhood Alzheimer friendly, to say we are cleaning up this river, we are replanting that tiny forest, that is just amazing. And I think without that, I don't know what to do for myself.
On the immigration point, here's an example of that third area I got into, of the personal dilemmas that I wrestle with a bit, because this is an area where I feel a tension between me as a journalist and me as a human being. Because journalistically, I have to get my head around the fact that millions of British voters do not like immigration as a phenomenon. The numbers are always there, there is concern about small votes, and I have to sort of take that on board and take that as a premise. So last week, for example, just last week, the column I wrote was about the small boats crisis and how there is a potential solution involving a more closer relationship with Europe, and that proves that the Brexiters have actually made migration worse and so on. But all of it was taking it as accepting the premise that we don't want migration. That was the starting point. That Labour and the Tories are offering to the voters different ways to keep down the numbers. And you can't sort of engage with the political conversation of the country unless you at least are cognizant of that. And yet, on a human level, I have very little real understanding of that opposition to migration. Or the minute I do feel it, it's very quickly snuffed out. I don't know how many of you read Danny Finkelstein's book about, called Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad. You cannot read that book without thinking at the end, if refugees want to come, let them in. Don't ask too many questions. They're desperate. They need somewhere to live.
Exactly.
Your job is to let them in. And I don't see how Jewish people can really take any other position than that. And when Jews particularly go on about, economic migrants, well, who do we think a lot of our great-grandparents were? They weren't all, fleeing the pogrom in Anatevka. They were all, a lot of them wanted just a better life. I find myself thinking, whatever else the ins and outs and red wall seats, and you've got to calculate, we at least, the Jewish community, have just got to make a very clear, almost sort of morally uncompromised position, which just says asylum, refuge, yes. That's what we have to do, and deal with the details later. And even when I see these numbers, again, this is an example, the numbers have reached 45,000, whatever it says on the radio, as if it's the greatest number. And I think the country's 70 million people, 45,000, we can take that. It's not that big. Now, when I put my professional hat back on, I go down to the House of Commons, you can't say that to a politician of either party. They'll look at you as if you're mad. The only argument, how do we get it down? And but on a Jewish level, I feel compelled to say that. And I do really wonder how Jews, and also other people who are children or grandchildren of migrants, are able to adopt these very anti-migration postures. We can think of very high-profile officials with responsibility for this area who don't get that, and I don't know how to do that. So I often find myself saying, yes, on the one hand, policy this, proposal the other, but basically let them come is sort of where I emotionally feel, and that's something I find the tension between the two.
So it's a fascinating question. I mean, the first thing that says, well, politicians deal in hope, and they can't really deal with the pessimistic because they need to get that vote. Scientists deal in facts, and that's inherently slightly pessimistic. And so, arguably, it's the job of civil society to bridge the two. And how do we do that? I think more specifically, Margaret, I was reflecting as you were talking there. My family has lived in England, unsurprisingly, in India, in Bermuda, in Canada. No one's worried about that. No one's worried about that at all. And when you look at migrancy and human history, what makes humanity so amazing, so great, is our diversity. If we were to take a trip down to the Avebury stone rings, which predates the arrival of Christianity or Judaism or any other religion in this country, under one of those stones was a body, or some very old bones. Those bones came from a man who did not live in this country originally. This country has been entirely built on migration. So the first thing is there is a reality there in human history. And if you try and homogenise your society, it tends to fail. There are other things I would just sort of put out there. I like your point, 45,000. We're not threatening our carrying capacity. But actually, if you spoke to the person who is deeply against migrancy, that's exactly what they'll say. In fact, we're hampering industries at the moment because they cannot get the right people. But there are two sort of possibly less good things around it. It's the brain drains we cause. Because actually, if we're not going to go and deal with the reasons behind migration, why are people leaving our countries? That mixture of economic opportunity, yes, but also the fact conditions aren't good enough there. Now, the ability to reduce the food supply to Africa, to then fire refugees to cause discord in Europe, that's a horrible thing to do, because it means we know the World Food Programme did not have enough food last year as a result of the Ukraine war. Our food got slightly more expensive. Well, we can cope with that. There are countries where there was not enough food. Pakistan, for the first time in its history, due to weather-related incidents, possibly the climate crisis, had to import food, and that food was more expensive. Families could not afford the food they needed as a result of that Ukraine war. So people will move. So if we don't deal with these things at the point of crisis, or the point of cause, then it will continue. Now, if we take the example of Somalia, Somalia went through a period where the expatriate community started returning, and it was fantastic because they were the ones who were successful. They had come to places like Europe, they developed businesses, skills, they could go. That's exactly what Somalia needed. But they got bombed out. Al-Shabaab did not take kindly to them. Russia, not a country in my good books, but of the 100,000 or so Russians who have gone from Russia, that's a huge number of people from the tech industry, for example, because they know they can get jobs. So there are fewer talented people in Russia to make the bits of civil society we don't object to work. So I think the sort of fundamental here is partly that actually as a nation we haven't asked what migrancy means and is, but secondly we haven't asked why. And the reality is, who would not take their child to a better future? Yeah. And if I have the right to do that in Australia or America or Germany, who am I to deny that to others?
Thank you. I'm really interested, by the way, that we frame some of these facts and the stories that we tell. You talked about 45,000, immigrants, and how that sounds like a scarily big number, but actually it isn't. And also we talked about the sort of possibilities of technology that provides both connectivity and also a window into other worlds that drive us insane. And so I think that we can, we can spin these stories differently. I think there's a very hopeful history of humanity, which is about migration and the cross-pollination of cultures and the invention, and the creativity that stems from that. There's a couple of directions I want to go in, and one of them is I want to ask whether, with these big global patterns that you're describing, is there anything that I could do that would make me feel that I was cognizant and aware and making an effort? Rabbi Jonathan, you spoke particularly about the sort of cruelty inherent in the production chains of the things that we purchase and the things that we use and the labour that we indirectly employ. Can we have a suggestion from everybody about something that we think could be an ethical way in which to address some of these challenges? I realise it's going to feel small, but it's also necessary to give us something positive to move around with. So, who wants to go first?
All right, I'll go first.
Thanks.
I think that I really am struck by Jonathan's point about cruelty and the demonstration of individual acts of just civility. I'm not even going to go as far as saying kindness. Now feels to me like an act of defiance, when the social media world particularly is so coarse and aggressive that just, at the smallest level, just seeing a stranger on a bus and smiling to them, feels like a little act of defiance.
Land us in an asylum.
Yes, you get in trouble. But what I mean is, I look at it, I now hardly engage on it, because it was so vicious and very, it could be personally very distressing, the abuse, if you write something publicly, the response and everything. So horrible. But if people pay a compliment publicly like that on them, that's nice. Or you just treat another human being as another human being. Just those tiny daily interactions. I just think those things now feel more, I don't know whether it's partly to do with getting older, but they feel more important.
I'm going to speak to that. Actually, I did give a sermon, I don't know if anyone was in the room, where I spoke about David McRaney's book, about how minds can change. And also I'm now reading Anand Jaraj's book, The Persuaders. And they're really about civil discourse, about how we've forgotten how to have manners and how to engage in polite conversation. And so there seems to be, extreme versions of what looks like communication, but actually going back to having civil discussion, being polite, approaching conversation as a collaboration exploration rather than as a sort of personal ego contest. You know, some of our forms of media have lent themselves to really poor forms of communication. I feel actually nothing we've ever done has not emerged out of an initial conversation. So if we could do better conversations, that might have a knock-on effect. And I'm sort of heartened by some of the ways in which young people are taught to converse. Younger people, particularly, I'm noticing that they're able to speak about their needs. Like, we sometimes talk about snowflakes, but actually I find it helpful to be told by a neurodivergent young person, I need to fidget, but I am listening. You know, I think that's wonderful, because that excuses behaviour that would otherwise trigger a cascade of sort of rudeness and incivility. So, you know, I kind of agree that manners and civil speech might be a key that could unlock many doors. I'm certainly going with that. So thank you for raising that. Yeah, any other old-fashioned good ideas?
Yeah, I'm just on a couple of different things, but on this line. So I was in town and I saw one of the big nurses' strikes outside UCH. And I think our community owes a lot to that hospital for the number of people cared for there. Actually, unfortunately, one of my good friends died there. And one of the last things he said was the nurses amazingly allowed a horse in the lift up to the 14th floor for a teenage girl who was dying to say goodbye to her companion. I think these people are fantastic. So I go to a Lebanese vegetarian falafel store and say, I want half a dozen falafels, please. They say, what do you need them all for? I say, those nurses must be hungry. They say, right, we're cutting our rate to half, or you can have them free, and they make them in a hurry. I think people are waiting for the opportunity for kindness, and when that comes along, people are jumping on it. So I think there's a lot of untapped humanity just longing to express itself, and that's a sign of hope. The other thing is that I don't really hear among teens the same sort of going to Primark to get a one-off item of clothing for this party. Many people I talk to will never go to a new clothes shop if they can avoid it, but will buy from charity shops, will buy pre-loved, will look online for something on eBay that's been sort of opened but not used, will rethink their consumption habits. And also, I've noticed the return popularity of repairing stuff. You don't just chuck it out. You try and, wait a minute, do I really need another one? So I think there's some change afoot there which could be built on.
Thank you. I like being able to see these big changes are taking place, and we are seeing them unfold. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's a really interesting question. What do we do? I look at big strategic issues. So the first thing, and I learned this from a wonderful chap called Chris Ravel, which is learn to disagree well. A couple of years ago, I was on a strategy course with 100 people from 43 different nations. And I could look at a clear set of evidence that everybody agreed. And I could say, this is the answer. And Abu Znaid, the Palestinian police officer, would turn around and say, John, I have the same facts and you're plainly wrong. This is the answer. And Avi, who is a member of the Israeli military, would say, John and Abu Znaid, you're both great people, but you're both wrong. So there's different perspectives, and in some ways being less certain. And I think that makes us, in a way, need to be more curious, less certain sometimes, and ask ourselves if the way we work, the way we live, is it fair and is it equitable to others? What's the knock-on effect? Have I, in where I work, have we got a secret code we don't realise is secret? When I walk past someone, am I making an assumption? And is that assumption right? But I do think you're right about that, seeking out small acts of kindness. People want to demonstrate they reflect the values they profess they have. And very few people, at least in this country, profess to be cruel. But many people are. So how do we get people to reflect on that, please? I don't know the answer. Can I pose you a dilemma though? So making the world a better place, and looking at the terrible tragedy of Ukraine. So let's assume we have £10,000 in front of us. Let's go £250,000 in front of us. Our natural assumption is we should go and buy medical kits, and that will look after the injured. It will save lives. Now, I have a friend who's in the Ukraine. He's a Ukrainian military officer, and he's been through a few tough times. And he says, John, that's very nice, we'd appreciate it hugely. But if you spend that £250,000 on weapons, you'll stop a village being hit. So instead of doing first aid to the survivors, no one's been hurt in the first place. But of course that would mean by saving those innocent civilian lives, we're now killing Russian soldiers. And no matter how cruel and awful those people can be, they are still souls. So there is a dilemma there. Would you save more lives by taking some, knowing that money you have raised is killing some? That's a really interesting point. I don't know if you have a view on that.
And you're putting a different train of thought in mind, because when you said you've got that £250,000, I'm thinking about that dam. And one of the questions in my mind is, I think Western civilization has lived with the assumption of the superiority of the human being above all creation. One can translate, I mean that does translate, that can be traced to a colonial approach which invokes the Bible as the right to dominate nature and savages, and that then leads to a kind of mechanistic view of the rest of the world and the rest of creation. But I'm asking myself, as war destroys landscapes as well, by what right do we have to propagate ourselves as a species at the cost of other species? What's the place of God in non-human life? Is it sacred too, and how sacred is it? And are we also under the illusion that we can survive without it? So what does one do about the destruction of nature was one of the things that went through my mind when you said £250,000, which wouldn't go very far in any of these issues.
Actually, if I may just very briefly answer part of that question. The repair of Ukrainian housing stock will require millions and millions of tons of concrete. It's one of the least environmentally friendly things out there. So destruction isn't just what we see now, it's when we repair it. So the impact just worsens and worsens. Back to the happy notes.
I'll take the microphone. I mean, this was what you, Jonathan Freedland, sort of said. You know, we can be Cassandras and Jeremiahs, and we can talk about all the horrors in the world, and you know, we don't have solutions to them, and they are bigger than all of us, and you know, which is why we have to sort of seesaw back and forth between things where we can have some sort of impact or feel that there are general tendencies which might be moving in the right broad direction, you know, in areas that will, you know, will not see the solutions to. So I mean, I think I'm intrigued, you know, I would like to invoke some ideas that, you know, when I think about my pot of money, some of my pot of money, I think I want it to go into education. I think broadly, I believe that educational institutions can be the engines of future good. And so that feels to me like an investment. And then, interestingly, I also think a lot about the arts these days, because I think we have a very unimaginative government that I don't think really recognises the way in which lives can be enriched and minds can be opened by artistic endeavour. And also artistic endeavour really often has an impact locally. It's often collaborative. It's often that, you know, people come together to sing or to make things or to watch or make movies, and actually, you know, that's where a lot of change and energy comes from. And I was talking to my daughter who's about to go up to university to study politics, and she said that she'd heard that an old IKEA in Tottenham is about to be turned into a big nightclub. And she said, well, you know, people who understand stuff know that when you're a government and you're trying to bring about big change and everybody's having a horrible time, people need to have some joy. And the nightlife And the arts are a big industry with a lot of energy and a real buzz, and they bring a lot of joy and fulfillment, and they create a climate in which other things shift. And we reflected again about how the NHS has found that it can save a huge amount of money by having social medicine, having interventions where, you know, people are befriended, or people go and play table tennis in a table tennis club, or collaborate to write poetry or sing together. You know, and it feels to me like actually some of these human community level things are the places where I see chinks of light, and I look for hope. And I sometimes think that these small, inexpensive projects are actually the ones that are part of a bigger cultural shift. So that's my tuppence worth.
I think Churchill I'm not sure it was 1941 or 40, it would be 42, had the dilemma whether a particular convoy should bring beer for Christmas or more weapons, and I think he felt that people needed beer at that point. So, yeah. Yeah.
I think the Jewish calendar leads us through, in fact, a sort of journey. You know, you can see the arc of the journey that we go on, which actually starts well before the High Holy Days. It starts at Tisha B'Av, which is the nadir, it's the point of utter destruction where our civilization was decimated, where we were exiled, and our temple and our religion and our faith and our society as we knew it was decimated. And from the ashes and from total destruction, you know, there's only up, and we build towards, you know, in this period, you know, there is a tradition that this was the period of growth. It looks like a fallow period, but actually the culmination of the High Holy Days emerges out of that destruction there. And then we move from Rosh Hashanah, which celebrates creation, through Yom Kippur, stock taking, through to Sukkot, which is a festival of joy. It's a festival of abundance. It's harvest festival. And, you know, that is the destination. And for the Jewish people who only show up in Shul and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, they never get to the fun bit, which is a shame, because the joy might be the greatest engine of change, I would advocate.
And that relates to one of the dilemmas you, Jonathan, said right at the beginning, which if you present people with the facts, they will respond accordingly, notwithstanding the different possible interpretations of those facts. But I've heard a lot of environmentalists say, we've got the facts, but we don't have the stories, and we don't have the music, and we don't have the poetry, and we're not communicating in a way that draws people in and draws people together and brings that solidarity and also appeals to the imagination as well as to the empirical mind. So,
and if I may say something else as well, this is one of my personal hobby horses, is that I think the way in which we take stock and account for how civilizations work doesn't measure some of the really important things. Our measures of economic growth leave out really essential things. They don't really talk about the caring work, they don't really remunerate the caring work, and they don't really recognise it as being part of the bottom line. And I find that ludicrous. I find it crazy that you build roads but not build nurseries and childcare or social care for old people. They seem to me just as important, but also, you know, the things that drive a society to be functional. And so, you know, I would argue that one of the changes that I would like to see would be a different way of measuring where a society is that took into account sort of a global well-being rather than, you know, just how much money is being made or how much money or how much the economy is growing. Actually, I think in an earlier conversation we spoke about how, you know, this perpetual growth of an economy is obviously unsustainable at every level, but also it doesn't tell an authentic story about people's quality of life. So I'd like to hear maybe from John, actually, any reflections on that?
So I think it does speak to the problem of the concept of constant growth. Because constant growth is viewed solely as financial wealth. Now we know we need money. You know, no one is suggesting that, you know, money is entirely a bad thing. But how do we turn around to people and say, you're going to be a bit poorer, and your children are going to be a bit poorer? Instead of the last sort of few decades where every generation has had a better lifestyle, it's going to be worse. Why is it going to be worse? Because we're going to go and fix some of the problems around the world and in the communities. That's a conversation that's really difficult to have. And there's the bit I know that if someone turned around and said, hey John, what we're going to do is when you die, we're not going to let kids inherit anything. So they're going to do quite well anyway. You know, they're in a great place, great part of the country, great schools. So we know they're probably going to be successful. So any money you're going to leave behind, we're going to take it from them and give it a much better cause. Now, morally, that's really difficult for me to object to. But I suspect I would do everything in my powers to avoid it. So how do we persuade people to give stuff up? How do we persuade people more philanthropic with their money? And if we look at sort of the Victorians, you know, not necessarily the kindest of societies or the nicest of societies, but the philanthropic movement in the Victorian era made huge difference. So how do we create a new philanthropy? I don't know.
I think I'm wondering whether our society is driven so much by I have as I want, because we're constantly encouraged to follow a curve of dissatisfaction, and the basis of that is the assumption of unhappiness, that it's what I haven't got that I need, and when I've got it, it'll still be what I haven't got that I need. So there's something inherently destructive about that, and it's accompanied by the fact that we value inadequately an awful lot of public goods, including nature, which do in fact bring satisfaction and happiness. So and again, ecologists talk about the importance of spiritual change and reorientation in terms of values. And I think some of that's happening, but it's important to call it out. One thing I can't bear to watch anymore is adverts on television, because they're telling me I need things which I don't need, and I dislike the fact that I know that I'm part of that trajectory.
I mean, just one point about the optimism is that I think, and it's often small, but there are these hankerings and yearnings for the kinds of things I think you've all been describing, we've all been describing. It was the smallest thing and it came and went, but the clap for carers thing always still stays in my mind. The appetite that people had to be together with other people, and you know, the weeks after it started, it was only meant to be 1 week, I think. People carried on doing it, and I recognise that sort of longing that's there. I think in a way we have a different, we meaning the people in this community, in this room, because Jews in this, and especially in an organised community like this, do have community really, and there is a calendar and a structure, and you know people just from being in Synagogue. But a lot of people don't have that. People who are not part of faith communities or not part of ethnic communities, ethnic minority communities, they don't automatically have that. But I really do detect the longing for it. So the people latch on to really quite sort of, you know, fragile pegs on which to hang this longing. You know, thanks to my sons, I have become very late in life a football fan, and I do see in there lots of people, men in particular, who don't really have a chance to be with other people. I mean, this is a whole riff, by the way, about how similar it is to being in shul, you know, where everyone knows when to stand up, when to sit down. No one has to coordinate it. There's certain tunes that everyone knows. I see in that, you know, there is a longing to be with other people, because actually they could watch the game and get a better view on their own on TV, but they don't. They want to be with other people. So I notice that all the time. There is this longing, and it is often an unmet need, but as a basis for optimism, the fact that people still want to, with all the tech and all the commercialism you're describing, people do still have a hunger for that sort of connection and togetherness.
I was just going to say, actually, in response to what John said, the inheritance dilemma, which I've been thinking about this lately as well. And I think this goes back to the idea of framing, that if we said, well, your children won't get this big lump sum, but local schools will be better. Everybody will be able to get free musical instrument tuition. You know, we could reframe the benefits to a happier society as actually benefiting us individually. And I think we maybe aren't always telling the right stories. I mean, I try and say to my children, I believe that we're in fact very, very rich because we basically have what we want. Sometimes we want stupid stuff and then we rationalise it, and mostly we basically have what we want. And how could you be richer than being able to get what you want? I mean, that is the very definition of luck and wealth and comfort or whatever. So I do wonder about just telling ourselves different stories as a way to also encourage ourselves to live those truths. And also the thing we would always pick up on was this idea of community, and that really people are trying to fill the empty void in their lives, which advertisers exploit and which manufacturers exploit. But really, we all know it's spiritual, however you use the term spiritual. It's a desire for communion and for connection with nature, with the divine, with one another, to feel part of something bigger in a football game, in a place of worship, all of those things. I do think, and I don't know how, Rabbi Jonathan and I were at different stages in our career, but I sometimes think of myself that my aspirations for my rabbinate are really modest, which is, if a few people are mildly more functional than they would otherwise be, there is a sort of cascade of positivity that comes out of that, which is possibly the good that I can do. So that's kind of my own personal takeaway. Sometimes it feels like a cheat, and sometimes it feels like a real thing. I feel like we've had a really fruitful discussion, and I think I'm going to just wrap it up. I'm looking at Rabbi Jonathan and John, because I think we've left it in a good place. And it's been a fairly long evening. I don't know, should I take some questions?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
We will take 3 questions. I will be strict, and we'll just see where they take us, and then we'll finally wrap up. Would you like the mic for a moment?
I probably can speak loudly enough.
Could you use the mic for the recording? Thank you.
I have a question about truth. The word truth has come up in shared facts and truth. One of the things that worries me in this world today is disinformation and misinformation and the distortion of truth, and particularly for Jonathan as a journalist. How do we begin to address something fundamental? Because we all may agree that there are facts, but a lot of people don't. They say it's conspiracy.
Thank you so much for raising that. It did come up a bit earlier, actually, the disagreement about what constitutes a fact.
No, it's a central issue of our time. I mean, it is what the populist authoritarian movements use, and it's a very powerful weapon now, this thing, because, just as an example, this Russell Brand business going on now. Let's say we don't know, obviously, innocent or proven guilty, but there's all these accusations. All he has to say is, they want to get me because they, the powerful establishment. It's the same maneuver that Trump uses, which is, the fact that 97 federal felonies against him only goes to show how much of a vendetta they're pursuing. It's an amazing idea that, multiply credibly accused. So, when Ronnie Biggs is accused of the great train robbery, he says, see, this really proves I'm getting under the skin of the establishment. It's such a sort of amazing trick to pull. So we do have to do it. I think what people can do in their own individual lives is the sort of information hygiene. I think maybe people are moving away from social media anyway in terms of Twitter and everything, because Elon Musk's apparent campaign to destroy his own company. But what people need to do is it's very obvious that I would say this, but to limit your supply of information, almost the way you would limit your kind of water supply, to those that are kind of kite marked and are validated, and be really vigilant about policing your information supply. And the test, I would say, it doesn't mean you always agree with it. I'm not saying you only have to read The Guardian. I'm saying you have to read and only share and pass on information sources which have a mechanism by which they publicly correct themselves when they're wrong. That's the way you can tell. So, The Guardian has many, many flaws, but it has a corrections and clarifications column every day which says, we got the following 6 things wrong yesterday. It has a reader's editor who says, hypothetical example, that cartoon we ran, we should never have run. The other publications, New York Times and BBC, have mechanisms like that. If they have that, left or right, fine. If they don't, then I would say you can't trust or rely on them as a source, and you shouldn't be passing it on. But in the same way you wouldn't be passing on contaminated water. So I think that's the bit that's on us as individuals, is to police our own information hygiene, and then obviously, in terms of governments and other things. There's a whole variety of things they can do. But tonight, I think we've usefully been trying to focus on what we as individuals can do. So I shared with you your assumption or insistence that truth is the bottom bedrock principle for all of it.
Just two things there. One is, if people haven't read Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny,
Right.
should read it. He wrote it in the months after Trump was elected. It's just brilliant on this question of truth. That was about 20 years ago. I kind of began to feel we've left the age of empiricism and re-entered the age of mythology. And that really frightens me. But I think it may be the case.
So I'm going to take a very Russia-focused angle on this. And I'm going to do a bit of history geek moment, if I may. So during the Russian Civil War, there was a bit of interference from outside. The Americans sent forces, the Japanese sent forces, German Freikorps went, the French went, we went in from Siberia and through India. And during the analysis of the Russian Revolution, Lenin wrote that all of these forces should have stopped the revolution, but they failed because the other powers did not unite. And so a cornerstone of Soviet policy, which we now see in Russian policy, was do not let your enemy unite. And it leads to a thing that's often referred to as active measures, not entirely correctly, where if you're an autocracy, if you say, everybody turn to the left, you turn to the left or you fall out of a window. In a democracy, people question. And so one of the techniques is when Russia says something that's not entirely true, its population can't question it. But everyone here goes, well, we need to understand this. And there was a great thing a while ago where a politician in the UK was calling for the release of secret information, which, if given, would probably compromise the lives of people. Of course, the government's not going to release that. Now, of course, if you then follow Russian social history, you see the period as communism starts to fail, but it's still a police state. So we could be in a room, and we know the next 5-year plan is utterly rubbish, but we can't say that. And in fact, in 1978, when the Russians go into Afghanistan, there are a lot of people going there to try and create the Soviet socialist state in Afghanistan, and they don't believe in it, but they can't say that. And so there's a phenomenon in Russia where I could be lying to you, you know I'm lying to you, and I know that you know I'm lying to you, but that's fine, because I'm more powerful. So I think that's really dangerous. And in fact, a little example, in 2014, when the little green men appeared in Ukraine, in Donbass, some of our major press outlets were saying, oh, and the Ukrainians say it's Russians and the Russians say it's not them, and reported the two sides. Now, I have a friend who is very good at understanding Russian military equipment. He said, that tank only exists in Russia. No one else has one. That tank there, they haven't painted out its registration number. I can tell you the Russian unit it comes from. And as a civil society and in the journalist field, we did not investigate, we just reported. So I think that bit about information hiding is really important at all levels. And I think the other bit, which it probably combines these things about the internet and the need to get away from it, is the internet creates the echo chambers for that. And when you follow disinformation, the first reference will be absolutely support the line, but the source is pretty rubbish. The second reference is quite good, but it doesn't really support the line. The third is unimpeachable as a reference, but has no relation to it whatsoever. But we don't read the references, do we? So I think we need to teach society, and particularly upcoming generation, to be more questioning and be more evidence-based. But I think also we've got to bear in mind, to quote Churchill again, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has got his boots on. How do we cope with that?
I think we might end there, and I think one of my takeaway just now is that there's a real measure, a sort of balance to be found between challenging and civil conversation. You know, what we spoke about being able to we spoke earlier about being able to disagree in constructive and appropriate ways, and we also spoke now about challenging facts. But actually one of our concerns was the sort of general tenor of conversation and how abusive conversation can get. And so I suppose, you know, information hygiene is something I'm going to take away. Avoiding cruelty, you know, in all its manifestations, including along the supply chain backwards, is something that I'm going to take away from tonight. That, you know, there's still plenty to worry about, but actually being part of a society that tries to model effective ways of being, it's not nothing. I guess that would be my takeaway. And it's wonderful to be part of a real exchange of opinions with such interesting speakers and such a broad-ranging conversation at a time of year where it feels like we're really, really interested and invested and responsive to thinking about the state of the world and what we can do about it. So we'll leave it there. Thank you.